As the Bible tells us, Moses received the Ten Commandments from God on Mount Sinai. But the Ten Commandments, in addition to being a guide for the Israelites, served another purpose. And I think we've seen this in our own day lived out several times. Even in my own relatively short lifetime, I've seen how in a part of the world where there was an oppressive system set up, maybe the oppressive system was lifted, maybe it changed. But if you look at that same country 10 or 15 years later, you realize that the oppression hasn't gone. It just looks different than it used to be. And so we got rid of communism in Eastern Europe, but instead the countries there are filled with lots of problems caused by organized crime. Or apartheid has gone in South Africa, but in South Africa there's many problems of violence. And so oppression on its own, lifting the oppression, ending the oppression, that doesn't always solve the problem. Something else has to happen. A new way of living has to be established. A new guideline for the way that people need to live has to be set up so that the oppression just doesn't change form. And I think that's why God gave the commandments to the Israelite people after they left Egypt, but before they got to the Promised Land. They had to learn about a new way of living, a new way of treating each other, so that when they got to the Promised Land, they didn't end up just doing the same kind of things that they'd seen before in Egypt. It's easy to take the Ten Commandments lightly because, while we value them, if you just look at a superficial surface reading of the Ten Commandments, they're fairly easy to keep. Most people, for instance, haven't stolen any cars in the past week, probably not in their lifetime either, right? So when we look at the command to not steal, generally we feel fairly good. Luther had a different approach to the Ten Commandments. He thought that one of the purposes of the commandments was, in addition to guiding our behavior, they're also supposed to drive us to look to Jesus for mercy. And when he looked at the commandments, he had a much deeper view of the commandments than just the superficial surface look. So if you read a book of his called The Large Catechism, he goes through the commandments in this way, and it's very interesting, but it also kind of makes you squirm a bit too. When his explanation of the command not to steal, for instance, he says, well, maybe you haven't stolen anything, but did you ever slack off at work a bit? Because it's essentially the same thing, right? Or with regards to the command to not have any idols, most of us haven't bowed down in front of any stone statues recently, but Luther reminds us that idolatry is really something that happens in the heart. And so he says, have you placed all your hopes for the solution of your problems in something that isn't God and that really can't solve your problems? Because that's essentially what idolatry is. And he goes through the commandments in this way with everyone. Each one of these commandments, maybe we haven't disrespected our parents, but do we disrespect other people who take the role of our parents on when we step out of the house, like teachers at school, for instance? And he explains the commandments in this fashion, and as you read them, you realize, whoa, none of us escape. We all have stumbled and fallen, and do it frequently as well. But that's the whole point. Yes, the Ten Commandments are supposed to guide our behavior, and they do, but they also drive us to look to Jesus for mercy. But that is the whole point of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are a guide to our behavior. We are supposed to live according to them, of course, but they also drive us to the mercy of God. And if it were that easy to keep the Ten Commandments, then we wouldn't need God's mercy. It's ultimately the commandments that force us to look to Jesus who died on the cross and drive us to ask God for mercy and to recognize that we're not perfect and we will never be perfect. But acknowledging that allows us to be that much more thankful and grateful to God for what he did for us, and our gratitude is yet one more reason to keep the commandments. Gracious God, we praise you and thank you for your grace. We thank you for giving us guidelines and rules in which to live. And we thank you for the harmony and the safety that these provide us. But we also thank you for the fact that you died on the cross and you offer us grace and mercy, those who ask for it, when we don't live up to your commandments, which none of us do. Help us to value that grace and be grateful for that grace always. Help us to look for you for mercy always as well. Amen.
White in his blood, most precious, till not a spot remains.